let's just start. Let's start simple because a lot of it is about the Berkshires. Tell me about why you came here and why you stay here.
Well, it goes. Although my life has taken a very desultory, if not tortuous path, and there actually is some logic to, and it began in Iowa where I was born and raised. And when I left the University of Iowa, one of my favorite teachers said, well, you're going to New York, here are two teachers you should look for. These are acting teachers, theater teachers. And I don't remember the one name, but the other name was Kristen Linklater. And it wasn't long after I arrived in New York City that I just saw an ad in one of the industry publications that she was teaching a voice class. She was at the time and still is a renowned voice teacher for actors. And so I called and I took a class with her that summer. This would have been 1974. I ended up working very closely with her then that fall in a new theater company she was starting. Then I quit the theater I've quit the theater a dozen times over the course of my life, and that was one of the first times I quit it. But I established a very strong connection with Kristen. So when I came back to the theater and came back to New York a few years later, I tried to pick up the trail, and she had since come to the Berkshires to help found Shakespeare and Company with Tina Packer and a few others. And so by following Kristen's trail, I found my way to Shakespeare and Company in the Berkshires. I wasn't here the very first year they performed. Shakespeare and Company, their inaugural performance was 1978. I arrived in the summer of 1979. So I go almost all the way back, but not quite. So I arrived in 1979 and was here for the summer, and then have come and gone many times over the years, but it's, well, I don't know. Between New York and the Berkshires, those two places have been my home pretty much.
Why did you quit acting so many times?
Well, I had my reasons at the time, and then there are the reasons one sort of begins to understand as time goes by. And for the longest time, I thought I was very wary of acting and actors, and thought that it was a vain exercise, and that it was my vanity that kept me interested and involved in the theater. I had a very sort of fiercely idealistic outlook on what I should be doing with my life, and kept thinking I should be doing something less selfish. And the theater seemed to me to be a very selfish thing to do. Acting especially seemed a selfish thing to do. This was compounded by the fact that whenever I found myself sitting in a room full of other actors waiting to audition, I found their behavior really unpleasant, and I didn't want to be part of that. And I also, and the other reason I've quit the theater, and this is something I began to understand more as the years went by, it became really clear, the pattern. When I was doing theater and acting, I was really happy and really fulfilled. And when I wasn't acting and couldn't find work in the theater, I was miserable. And when you're miserable frequently, you have to ask yourself, maybe this isn't the path I should be on. But I went back and forth between those two circumstances often enough to see it was really clear that it wasn't the theater that was the problem, or having a career. It was not being in the theater that was the problem. So I just had to renew my courage and conviction and say, enough of this going back and forth. Just have to stick it out, because this is the way it is. And that actually, I came to that, believe it or not, I came to that conviction pretty late in life, within the past 10 years. I mean, I was that ambivalent for that long about it. It's a relief to understand finally that this is, to know where one belongs.
So you don't think you'll quit again?
Well, one should never say never. I don't. Who knows what will happen? But I certainly don't experience the kind of ambivalence I used to. No, I don't.
It must feel. It reminds me of my friend who said, "Gosh, getting married was such a relief once you commit to something."
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
a relief.
Mm-hmm.
But so.
Well, it is like a marriage. It is like a marriage, and I think that was probably maybe I didn't have a terribly realistic approach to that particular marriage. I wasn't willing to tolerate the lows, and after I realized that there was no avoiding the lows, that came with the territory. Accept that marriage on those terms.
Well, let's talk about that. How you deal with, because a lot of what we're talking about is obstacles and failure and keeping on, going with the creative path, even though things are hard. So talk a little bit about the lows and how hard they are and how you got around them.
Well, this is not maybe a direct response to your question, but it's the thing that springs to mind when you ask that question. And this is something that I wish I had been better at when I was younger, because I've learned this lesson since, and I've seen other people younger than myself in the theater practice it. And that is to find a way to do the work whether you're being hired or not. Find a home, find a creative home, find a group of like-minded people who are just as hungry and just as desperate if you are, if that's what it is, that's where you are, and do some work. Do the work that you want to do and need to do. There's a tendency to wait. At least in a certain area of show business, in the theater, there are agents and there are casting directors and there are producers and so on. And to the extent that you're in that game, it's a waiting game. One is sitting by the phone and waiting to be called. And if you're being called frequently, then that's okay. But if you're not, that can become very discouraging. And that's when you need to find another way to stay engaged with the work, or it becomes a very discouraging, even debilitating situation. So that would be if I were to start over again, that would be my first advice to myself, would be to stay with the work. Don't wait for something that's more important or more impressive. Get busy. I think first of all, you grow in your craft when you do that. And secondly, you're practicing it, and hopefully one or two or three or four others will see you doing it, and things will move. There will be movement. It's a very different energy and a very different sort of dynamic from sitting at the phone. I don't mean literally, but figuratively. That's the way it feels a lot of the time.
A lot of people have mentioned that when they think their inspiration comes from actually being exposed to things like you're talking about, that they just go out, they see things, they involve themselves in other things, and that sparks something in them.
I think that's really, really true. I mean, at the very, very bottom of art, there's a timeless tradition of thievery. You are inspired by what you see, and you take something of that on and build on it or reshape it. But you have to. There are very few, I think, who are just. It's a fancy Latin term, I think. It's sui generis, just one of a kind. There are a few of those who are, that if they were locked in a room for 10 years, they would still create what they were born to create. But for the rest of us mortals, we need the inspiration, we need the example, we need the reinforcement that this is something that creates excitement and is something that is appreciated by others, and it gives us the courage and the strength to undertake what is actually a very difficult thing. Being an artist is being naked oftentimes, and I don't mean, of course, literally, but sometimes in a more profound way than standing without clothes in front of someone can be. It depends on the art form, and there are maybe some forms where you are more transparent or more conspicuous in your art than others. But certainly as an actor, when you're standing on the stage, people are basically approving or disapproving of me. Because if I'm doing my craft, I'm working from a certain level. I'm trying to go into a fairly deep part of myself and to bring that to bear on whatever the play or the character is. And if that's something that isn't, if the audience doesn't connect with that, or I don't connect with them, that's basically, we're not interested in you. And that's a tough experience. You learn from it, you grow from it, or you're defeated by it. There are a few options. But one needs to keep participating in the ritual of art in order to keep one's courage up.
Where did the courage come from to, and I think that's why you were selected as an innovator, because what the definition that's kind of coming out in my mind anyway is that it's someone who's willing to put themselves in a place of risk to do something else, really. And what makes you put yourself in that risky place?
Well, the cynical answer is boredom, tedium, trying to overcome what otherwise I find to be a very dull routine existence. There's just much of life that is really dull, I find. And I can't bear that, and I keep looking for something that will make my life richer and more interesting. And I'm looking for other people to give that to me, and I'm looking to contribute to that myself.
Well, other people.
I was going to say that's sort of the cynical response. Maybe the more optimistic response is to say that for a lot of artists, most artists I know, they're trying to express something, and they've chosen a particular art because they find that art form the most effective way for them to communicate with their friends, their family, their community, their country, their world, and for people who need to feel as though they are in communication with those around, art can become a really crucial connection. So it's a way of communion, at least communication. Oftentimes communion, if it's profound art, then it becomes more of a ritual of communion. And for me. This is not true for others. I want to make this clear that this is how I look at it. For me, my pursuit of an art form is a direct outcome of my religious training. And my religious training amounted to going to Sunday school in a Methodist church in Iowa. So it wasn't like I was a Jesuit or something like that. It was a very sort of routine religious background, but it went deep into me. And yet I couldn't sustain that form of spirituality, or that form of the pursuit. Theater seemed somehow, ironically, although theater for me was a breaking away from the constraints of my religious background, it also was a fulfillment of my religious background. If you can understand the sort of the paradox of that. So for me, the theater has become a spiritual path as well as an artistic one.
And what were the things that you felt early on that you couldn't let go of spiritually? The things that were taught to you that really stuck with you, that had to be transformed into the theater world.
Well, I don't recall the word being used in my religious training, but I think I got some whiff of transcendence, of something above and beyond who I am and my mundane existence, that there was something else to aspire to, something else to connect with. And it had to do with my own imagination and my own longing. And I think that left me with a desire to see something that had meaning for me, to seek meaning. I mean, that's a very sort of fundamental principle in any religious or spiritual discipline, is to seek meaning. And I think although the trappings of my Methodist upbringing didn't ultimately appeal to me very much at all, I think it did instill in me that need.
Well, that sort of goes back to that question I was going to ask about what you were saying in terms of people, in terms of needing to just have an interesting life. And
Yes.
there are other people in the world who feel that just getting by and living their life is okay. And then there are people who, for whom it's just not enough.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think is the difference between those two?
Well, I don't know. Socioeconomic status, genes, genetics, education. Education is huge. I think a combination of education and genetics, basically. I came from a farming community. Was one of the first people in my family to go to college for 4 years. It wasn't the last one by any means, but it was one of the first in that family. And certainly, no one had ever embarked on a career in the theater from my family. They were farmers and blue-collar workers. But there was a disposition in the family. There were amateur musicians and some beautiful singing voices and lots of community musical activity. So there was that thing was going. It was active, and so I had that going genetically, right, or in my family atmosphere. And then I had this freak of an English teacher who was like an alien community. Nobody knew how he had ended up there. I mean, it was totally other. There was no one else like him in our experience. Very flamboyant, very outspoken, very eccentric, and brilliant. And why he stayed in that community for 30 years to teach a bunch of farm kids, who knows? But he was there. And for the 4 years I was in his classroom, I just soaked it up. I don't know where this guy comes from, but whatever his influences are, I want that too. So he represented to me something that was outside the experience of my little town of Miles, population 400. And I studied literature and some theater with him. I mean, there was no theater in that little school. It was just a speech program. But I would work with him every year on a speech. And it was like having an individual acting coaching session with him. And so he infected me with the appetite for literature and Shakespeare in particular. So I very strangely became obsessed with Shakespeare at the age of 16 years old, which is not something that was typical of. There was no one else. There was no one else in my school who responded that way. So it's a bit of an anomaly, and sort of random intersection of factors. I mean, I want to take some credit because he taught lots of kids over the years, so I may have been different in some way. But I don't know if I would have been able to conceive of another way if there hadn't been someone, a teacher on whose shoulders I could stand.
What was his name?
Louis Logue.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you talk to him now?
Well, I did. I stayed in touch with him until he died, which he did about somewhere between 10 and 15 years ago. This is. I'm going to take a chance here, and because this reminds me of another. There's another layer to what I think art and artists are about. Art often comes from outsiders, and this teacher was an outsider. We were this totally homogenized, white, middle working class, small community. And there was this man dropped in the middle of it, who we thought was just eccentric, and he misbehaved a lot, but he was so impressive that we forgave him all sorts of things that he would be sued for, if he were teaching today in the classroom. But the parents all put up with it at the time. It was only later that I realized that he was an alcoholic homosexual. But I didn't know what either one of those things was when I was growing up. You know, so his sort of bad mood tirades in the morning and the gestures, that was theatrical to me. It was only later when I began to see, oh, I see. There are other people like him, but my point is that he was an outsider, and art often comes from the outside. People who either experience society on the margins or put themselves there, or some combination of the two. It's that, maybe that's the answer to your question, the difference between people who are content with life as it's offered and those who want something else or want something more or different. And I think it depends on whether you place yourself right in the mainstream, the herd, if you will, and are content with that, or whether you either find yourself because you are different. It can work both ways. You are different, and so it gives you a perspective. It puts you outside. It puts you outside the herd, and then it gives you a kind of objectivity or perspective that people who are totally in it don't have. They don't need to bother with that sort of reflection. But people who are different have to try and figure out why and how, and whether it's fair or not, and whether it's meaningful or not, and whether it's worth it to be different, or whether there's the one should struggle to rejoin the herd. And that dilemma or that exercise becomes art.
That's a great answer. I think that's. He sounds like a great guy.
He was a great guy. I have this huge photograph of him in my little office at home, and it was a very candid, informal photograph that one of his colleagues probably had taken when he was a teacher, and he's turning over his shoulder. It's obviously Christmas time. There's a Christmas tree behind him, and there's a little white dove in the Christmas tree. It's a very sweet little setting. And he's turning with this scowl as, how dare you take a photograph, which is typical of him. There's this absolutely disgusted, how dare you interrupt me or bother me or whatever. And I have him looking over my shoulder like that to remember he keeps me straight, which is ironic because he wasn't.
But it's also very interesting to me that part of the reason you were so influenced by him is because you had no context to put him in. Almost as if your inspiration came from just pure ignorance.
Well, if I had come from a more worldly background, I could have said, this guy's an alcoholic homosexual, no big deal. But because I didn't have any sort of context to put it into, I just thought he was a fascinating person, which he was. And maybe my ignorance and my naivete made it possible for him to go have an even deeper, more profound influence than he would have otherwise.
Oh, that's a great story. So is there anything else that you can think of that, sort of in the context of innovation or coming up with things that are new or things that one doesn't expect even from oneself, that may be inspirational to people who come to the museum, or go anywhere really, who feel like they think they have an idea or they think they're creative, but I'll leave that to other people. I don't think I can really tap into that.
Again, I'm not sure this is the most direct response to your question, but it reminds me of a lesson that I learned. Again, this was in my family. I have two younger brothers and two younger sisters, and when one of my younger sisters was still in high school, she was assigned to write a paper on Hamlet, the play, Shakespeare's play Hamlet. And of course, I'd had a couple of years of theater under my belt by that time, so she was consulting me to ask me if I could help her with the paper, and I said, well, let's talk about it. And she said, well, I just don't know what to make out of this character. I mean, he seems so undecided, and he lurches this way with such passion, and then he zooms off in this direction with such intensity, and he really doesn't seem to know at the core who he is. I said, that's Hamlet. That's Hamlet. Write that down. That's the paper. And I think that's the thing, that's such a fundamental lesson that we have to take with us, is that what we experience is the first step. It's not that, I mean, it helps to have to be trained. It helps to have education. It helps to have examples, yes. But if you're going to do something creative, you have to be in touch with your own personal response to the idea or to the object, whatever it is. If you want to create something, if you want to have something to contribute to the discussion, you have to be aware enough of your own personal response. If you don't have that awareness, whether it's awareness or self-respect, whatever combination of factors it is, you're doomed to writing from the Encyclopedia Britannica. You'll just have to write what other people say. And that's okay. I mean, I certainly, that was most of my high school reports. Where I got an A for copying verbatim one, which is I still ashamed of.
What do you do if you have the awareness and the experience, and you know that it's genuine, but then as you go through in your life and you have other people telling you the way you should think about this, or you don't know enough about this, or you don't know enough about that, and, well, it makes you feel naive and insecure.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's becomes the struggle of an artist's life, is when do I need to be humble, when do I need to be hubristic, when do I need to say, no, I know who I am and what I'm talking about. It's a really difficult thing, and it has to do, I think, with honesty. The honesty and humility, the ability to listen and take what I think is fair and accurate in terms of criticism and insight, and at the same time be able to trust that when I hear something that doesn't make sense to me, I can put that aside, rather than to say, well, that doesn't work for me, but it comes from an authority, so I have to do it anyway. That's a very subtle process, and some people have a strong enough sense of who they are and what they're about early on that they can navigate through that. Others, I think, I'm talking about myself now. It's taken me years to develop that kind of self-confidence, to actually, and so many experiences of, I should have listened to myself. I was right, but somebody older, wiser, said to me. It's taken me a number of those experiences to learn that I need to trust my own instincts more. But there's no formula to that, because it has to do with your environment, how trustworthy your mentors are, and how self-aware the mentee is. And that, of course, that equation shifts from relationship to relationship. Finding a mentor you can trust is really important. And a mentor not only you can trust in terms of that person's artistic savvy, but just personally that relationship is free enough of some sort of agenda, or isn't about dominance or imprinting you. Someone who actually is there to support me in my growth, rather than to be recreated in the image of the master. But I don't think you can learn that in school. I think you learn that through experience, and usually hard knocks, until you begin to develop an awareness of danger, safety. And you know what about art? It includes both.